Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin versus DXY, or the US dollar currency index. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with one of the general trends that we've seen basically throughout the last several market cycles. And what it essentially consists of is that as Bitcoin goes up, the US dollar tends to be going down and vice versa, right? So if the dollar is going up, then Bitcoin tends to be going down. And we've seen this happen on more than one occasion, right? So if you were to simply take the chart of Bitcoin and overlay the US dollar currency index onto the chart, one of the things you'll note, and let me actually switch this over to a weekly time frame. One of the things you may note here, generally speaking, right, is that as the dollar goes parabolic, Bitcoin tends to be in a bear market, right? And as the dollar goes down aggressively, Bitcoin tends to be in a bull market, right? And again here, right, the dollar was going down aggressively, Bitcoin was going up aggressively. Over here, the dollar was going up while Bitcoin was going down. And we've seen this trend play out over and over and over again. But what's interesting is that despite by looks, it certainly seems like they're inversely correlated. That's not always true, right? And again, the way to check that is to just simply go over to, say, a Pearson correlation coefficient matrix and look at Bitcoin's correlation to the dollar, and you can see that it's 0.28, right? So it's not highly positively correlated. It's not highly negatively correlated. It's near zero. If we go look at the Spearman correlation coefficient for it, it's about 0.44. So a little bit more slightly positive. But there's still no denying that, you know, through aggressive moves by the dollar, we have seen Bitcoin fall. And then through aggressive drops by the dollar, we have seen Bitcoin go up. But as you can see, there are some times where Bitcoin goes up while the dollar goes up, right? There are times where that has happened. But I think the main difference is these moves here are more or less parabolic moves by the dollar. And of course, Bitcoin and risk assets in general do not like it when the dollar is getting these types of parabolic moves. But one interesting thing that we've talked about with respect to the dollar is that, and I don't know if it's going to continue, but I posted a post on X a few weeks ago saying that it looks like the dollar is potentially mimicking the Bitcoin dominance accumulation phase a year or two ago. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, if we were to pull up Bitcoin dominance here on the screen, it's the green line down there, okay? Now, I just want to observe, and again, you know, just because it played out like this on one metric doesn't mean that it has to play out like that on another metric. But one of the things that I think about with the dollar is that you have this parabolic move, and then this has basically just been digesting the move before, I'm guessing, eventually it will make another run for a while. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a parabolic move like that one, but it could slowly start to trend back up again, right? Especially how you see like in 2019, you know, especially as we got into, you know, later and later 2019, the dollar did start to trend back up even after the Fed started to cut rates. Okay. So when you look though at Bitcoin dominance and the dollar, you can see two very clear trends, in fact, right? And essentially it goes like this. It goes like a low, a lower low, and a lower low. Same thing here with the dollar, right? A low, a lower low, and a lower low. And throughout that pattern, you had a high, a lower high, and then a higher high. Same thing, right? You had a high, a lower high, and then a higher high. So that first part of the pattern played out almost identically to Bitcoin dominance. And then what ultimately happened with the dollar is that it came back down and formed a higher low, just like Bitcoin dominance came back down and formed a higher low. And then from there, Bitcoin dominance had a slightly higher low, more or less a double bottom. But if you look at like daily wicks and whatnot, it was a higher low. And it was also a rejection off the bull market support band, which essentially is what we've seen here by the dollar. So I am curious if the dollar is sort of falling back in here to try to find either a double bottom or a slightly higher low, right? So as long as it's above, 100.6 or so, then it's still technically a higher low. Now, this is something I've been following for a while. Again, I posted about it on X a number of weeks ago, this very pattern when the dollar was going up, sort of suggesting that it could get rejected there in the short term for a short-term move back to the downside before ultimately moving back up. And actually, if you look at what happened in 2013, right, you'll see that the dollar fell around this same time of the year, right? So once we had this rally by the dollar in February, and then once we got into March, the dollar fell back down into late April, right? And so I do wonder if we're seeing something very similar play out here, where it's falling back in. And note too that when dominance came back in here, it ultimately fell back to some of these levels that it had previously tested. So if it were to fall back into that level from April of 2023, then it means going down, somewhere between 100 to 101. Now, I don't know if it's going to go that low or not. It could also form a higher low somewhere, anywhere between here. But I do think that pattern has a decent chance of playing out. Now, the reason why that's important is because when we think about Bitcoin USD, we know that it does tend to have some effect when the dollar is moving one way or the other, right? So over the last few weeks, we've seen the dollar start to move back down, and we've also seen Bitcoin moving up. Not only has Bitcoin moved up, but also risk assets in general have moved up over the last few weeks, and we've started to see the dollar fall. It's also the same idea where we saw net liquidity fall, going in, from in February when we saw the dollar dropping, and then once we got really into March, back over here, right, it fell in February, and then once we got back into March and into early April, the net liquidity indicator showed that the liquidity went up, and then it sort of slowly faded again. And one of the reasons it faded over here was because the dollar was going up. So I'm suggesting that, once we get into like late April, May timeframe, I could see the net liquidity indicator sort of rolling back over and going back down, because a lot of the central banks are still decreasing the size of their balance sheet, and it's also sort of assuming that the dollar follows the pattern by Bitcoin dominance. If it does not follow the pattern by Bitcoin dominance and it takes out these lows, then that would be something completely different. Okay. And if that happens, I'll make a video sort of addressing that. But at least at the current time, that is what I'm thinking is a potentially likely outcome. Is some form of a double bottom or a higher low, somewhere between 100 to 101, even up to 102 potentially, right? Anywhere in between. And if you go look at Bitcoin, of course, one of the things we've talked about a lot over the last several months is that what's essentially happening is that this rally by Bitcoin is slowly breaking altcoins down off of their Bitcoin support levels, right? We've seen a lot of them already break support, but there still are more, I think, that will ultimately break support sometime, in sort of the March to May timeframe, where ultimately alt Bitcoin pairs break down. And that's one of the reasons why Bitcoin gets these rallies, is because it's during these Bitcoin rallies where you can really see altcoins break down. They can also break down on Bitcoin drops, but rallies by Bitcoin can also lead to alt Bitcoin pairs sort of falling. And one of the things that we've mentioned is that we've noticed that there's been a lot of sort of like narrative driven stuff throughout this entire cycle, right? If you think back to the merge, what ETH did was it essentially rallied hard into a month before the merge on its USD pair, and then it faded, and then into September, into the actual merge, ETH USD put in a lower high, but ETH Bitcoin put in a higher high, meaning the rest of the market was already showing weakness on USD pairs by September, but because of the merge, ETH had another rally back up, forming a lower high, but the ETH dominance went up and the ETH Bitcoin pair went up. And so, with that in mind, we've talked about this idea of getting some form of a cool off phase by Bitcoin USD following the halving, right? And you could always have sort of a local top in March, followed by a lower high in April. You could even have the high in April if it were to follow something like 2021, right? If it did something like the year-to-date ROI stuff of Bitcoin, if you were to go look at 2024, if it were to follow 2021, right, it could even go all the way out until potentially April before sort of seeing that fade into the summer. And again, this is all dubious speculation, right? It's certainly possible that Bitcoin says to hell with all that stuff. We're just going to, continue to ride the momentum for as long as we possibly can. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that this has to play out. It's just something we've talked about for a while. And given the fact that we're seeing other confluence like gold breaking out, the fear and greed index sort of getting into the 90s. It's now back into the 80s, but it could certainly go back into the 90s, especially as we get later into March and especially closer to the halving. It seems like there's, again, there's a lot of confluence behind, this insane mania phase around the halving, and then following the halving, the market potentially cools off for a little while, which I think would be honestly a really good thing for the market. If it's unable to cool off for a while, that, of course, while everyone will be happy in the short term, that might turn out to be over a longer period of time not the best outcome. Because the problem with crazy rallies is that you then sort of have to, you then end up having to digest that for a much longer period of time. It's the same thing with the dollar, right? When you get these crazy rallies by the dollar, then you have to digest that move for a long time before you can actually get another sustained move to the upside. But one interesting thing we can do is we can look at Bitcoin risk versus the dollar, right? So if you're unfamiliar with the Bitcoin risk metric, it's this metric that I do frequently talk about on the channel. Let me just scroll up over here and show you. So we have this Bitcoin risk metric that basically just says, one potential strategy, and this is the strategy that I follow with Bitcoin, is to ignore basically everything. And I don't really care about the news. I don't really care about, what's the most recent narrative. I don't care about any of that stuff. I just want to know where's the Bitcoin risk, right? And right now it's at 0.707. But what's interesting is if you plot out the dollar, right? Or if you plot out the dollar and you color code the DXY by the Bitcoin risk, you get something that looks kind of interesting, right? Where, you get these periods of blue, right? Where you're at really low risk with Bitcoin, and it tends to correspond to the end of the dollar parabolic rallies, right? You can see that it occurred in 2014, 2015, and also it occurred in 2022. And then as the dollar sort of works its way back down, then the Bitcoin risk goes into much higher risk levels, right? Much higher risk levels, as you can see back over here in 2017 and in 2021, and even after the dollar, after Bitcoin risk went here in December 2018, and the dollar then kind of consolidated for a little bit, it more or less went sideways. You can see that Bitcoin risk went slightly up, right? And here the dollar hasn't really been collapsing ever since over here. It's been mostly just going sideways. So it certainly seems like there's a lot of confluence sort of coming to a crescendo in March/April, where not only do you have, again, gold breaking out, you have Bitcoin dominance in an uptrend. And I know today it's, I see the comments, right? But I mean, yes, I get that dominance has taken a little bit of a hit here, but if you just, I mean, if you just switch this over to a line, I mean, look at this chart. You know, I mean, it's moved up to the highs. Yes, it has been unable to durably break those highs, but the fact that it's spending more and more time up in this range to me suggests that it's ultimately going to break. And so, you know, what happens if it all plays out in a matter that we've been discussing, and that is, you know, you have this risk on dynamic by Bitcoin until approximately 56% dominance. And if you're still looking at the fear and greed in the 90s, gold is still sustaining that breakout, which I think it probably will. If blue chip dominance breaks above 73%, right now it's at 72.2, and so on and so forth. If all that comes to a crescendo at the same time that the dollar is potentially, you know, finding a higher low or a double bottom in here, then I think that would be sort of some justification or a catalyst for the market to cool off sometime thereafter the halving, right? And again, if you were to look at what ETH did going into the merge, if you remember ETH USD, right? This was the merge right here. And it put in a high a month before the merge and then a lower high during the actual merge. And then the market cooled off for a couple of months or so, right? And it was a much needed cool off too, after such an explosive move. So I do wonder if all this is kind of repeating itself, where by, you know, sometime over the March to April timeframes, you see all Bitcoin pairs break down, you see Bitcoin dominance break out, you see gold continue its breakout, fear and greed relatively elevated, the dollar making a U-turn, potentially, you know, somewhere between 100 and 102, and so on and so forth, then it might just be some confluence to keep in mind, right? And again, I mean, the sort of the difficult part about all this is that, I mean, at any point of the way, right, you could sort of speculate why any asset needs to find a local top. I mean, people have been trying to call the top on Nvidia forever, and it just keeps on going up. So to some degree, trying to predict exactly where that would be in terms of price is essentially a fool's errand, right? I mean, it's impossible. But if you have enough confluence, I do wonder if that would be sort of enough of a catalyst to lead to sort of a cool off phase sometime following the halving. Okay. And I just wanted to sort of present this idea from the stance of the dollar, because it does seem like it's repeating, you know, a pattern that it has repeated before, and then the Bitcoin risk seems to be repeating a pattern that it has repeated before. And so again, it all comes back to this idea of you know, can Bitcoin stay risk on long enough to break alt Bitcoin pairs down? And I think it will break alt Bitcoin pairs down. And the question is after it does that, assuming that it does then the dollar start to move back up as we get into the summertime? But that's my view on the dollar and on Bitcoin, and I will see how it plays out. I'm not going to make a video on the dollar that frequently. I don't even know if I'll make an update on this, but it is something that I noticed some people were talking about recently, because the dollar had a pullback, and I was thinking back to that post where we talked about potentially one more pullback by the dollar, followed by a move back up as we get into late April, May, June, July, etc. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We have tons of charts, not only for crypto, but also for equities and macro and more. So make sure you guys check that out, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.